Bernie Sanders is not Assata Shakur, Elizabeth Warren is not Martin Luther King Jr. Ultimately, Democrats support war. I mean, they vote for the budget over and over again with absolutely no resistance. I mean, these budgets pass with like one naysayer, and every Democrat votes for it, every Republican votes for it.
Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ramiro with Anti-Conquista. Anti-Conquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. We are entirely volunteer-run. We are not an NGO. We are not a for-profit media company. So please make sure to go support us on Patreon, patreon.com/Anticonquista. Most of our funds that we collect go to revolutionary movements in Latin America and the Caribbean that are carrying out revolution. Luckily, within the last 2 years, we've been able to send money to our comrades in Puerto Rico, in Haiti, and Colombia. And thank you so much for listening to us. Today, we have the honor of speaking with a good friend of ours, a friend of Anti-Conquista, Takiyah Thompson. Takiyah Thompson is one of the co-founders of RIOT, which is the Revolutionary International Organization de Trabajadores. And I just have to say, RIOT has one of the most badass names I've seen in communist groups out there. That's for the people. That's really cool. Has some amazing literature and social media posts out there that promote decolonized communism, a communism of Black and brown people, of women, of LGBTQ people. RIOT is definitely on the cutting edge of decolonized communism, of global South communism. Please go on Twitter and support and follow riot_revolt. And today I just wanted to talk with Takiyah about the 2020 elections. We're already getting all of the bullshit emails and messages of like, are you in for 2020? Are you in for Bernie? Are you in for the Democrats? And I'm just like, hell the fuck no. I don't give a fuck about the elections. Not because I don't care about politics, but because either way, if you vote Democrat or Republican, imperialism and racism and sexism and everything else are still going to continue. And so that's what I'm hoping to talk today with Takiyah about, and just to give a sense of what our views are as communists, as revolutionaries of the bourgeois electoral process in the United States. So Takiyah, thanks again for joining us. And how's everything on your end out there?
Black History Month, that's what we're working on right now. How about you?
Everything's good out here in LA. We've just been going to a lot of the protests, the Hands Off Iran stuff. Me and Ofelia, who's my partner and co-editor as well of Anti-Conquista, we've been getting involved here with some of the anti-war demonstrations and trying to put out a solid anti-imperialist message with Anti-Conquista. But yet again, everyone's attention is being focused back on these elections coming up, 2020 presidential elections and also other elections across the country. And I'm just so glad I'm getting a chance to talk with you about it, because I think you have one of the most solid perspectives of and critiques of the election from a point of view that's critical but also constructive, right? Because a lot of times people assume that like if you're against voting in the 2020 elections for Democrats or Republicans, that you're like an anarchist, that you're lazy, and it's far from the truth. You're just doing other work that is aside from the typical ballot box kind of work, that is actually working directly with the people, serving the people and meeting their needs. So starting off, I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts in general about the upcoming election, and why aren't you excited the same way that I'm not excited about this election coming up?
Well, I think because the positions presented don't really push society in general it forward. I think you just have nothing to be excited about when you look at the Democratic field. And I think about Bernie Sanders, who's, um, you know, undeniably pushes the Overton window to the left, but is still absolutely disappointing when it comes to what we're really struggling for. And I think, as you know, as a communist, of course, our struggle is around dismantling all of the isms that hold society as we know it in place. And Bernie Sanders is regressive, to say the least.
That's so true because people a lot of times call Warren and Bernie progressives, but I'm like, how can you be a progressive if you're not calling for the dismantling of US imperialism, for the dismantling of US bases around the world, and also not just being anti war, but anti imperialist? Because a lot of times people confuse the two, and it's like, for example, you can be anti war, but are you against the economic system of colonization and imperialism that sucks up and extracts resources from Africa, Asia, and Latin America every day and creates the standard of living that exists in the first world? Are you going to abolish that, or are you just going to be against direct war and intervention, which is kind of what I'm hearing from them? And for me, I just see Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders as examples of people who want to implement a kind of social imperialism where they can give out benefits and healthcare and free education and legalize weed for people in the United States, especially white people. But when it comes to global South people and people of color within the empire, they get the short of the end of the stick as always. And that wealth that's being distributed to people in countries like the US is based on the exploitation of black and brown workers around the world. And so that's why I totally agree with you. I'm not excited by their candidacies at all. And what do you think about people of color who are like trying to promote Warren and Sanders as these progressive revolutionary candidates?
I think it's definitely a problem. The way I see it, if you're going to endorse one of the candidates, um, you don't have to hide behind, a revolutionary rhetoric. It's okay to say that, I want to vote for the least of two evils, because, that's what you see yourself as doing, right? Like the other day, I saw this tweet that was like, ranked different Democrats by how closely their platform aligned with the Black Panther Party's 10-point program. And I'm just like, what? What is the point? The disrespect to the Black Panther Party, the disrespect to the movement as it is, So, yeah, I think when people support these candidates, it's important to, if you see yourself as a revolutionary and someone who is involved in other work outside of electoral politics, it's important to understand the vote for what it is. All of the candidates have said things like, that, kind of try to appease the anti-imperialist movement, such as, no war, no boots on the ground, as they like to say. But they still support the sanctions, you know what I'm saying? Which is, in a lot of ways worse than open warfare, in that, the sheer amount of civilian lives that get swept up into that. So I think we have to be like realistic. Like, Bernie Sanders is not, is not Assata Shakur. Elizabeth Warren is not Martin Luther King Jr. The idea of a transitional demand is fine. You know what I'm saying? If we look at Sanders or anyone else on the field's, policies, we have to ask ourselves, is this a demand that will deform the nature of capitalism as we know it, right? If not, then it's just simple reformism.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And people have to understand it from a structural base, because at the end of the day, people forget that like all of these decisions, all of these elections are built on the backs of exploited black and brown people, Africans and indigenous people who created the wealth of the United States to begin with. And for me, right off the bat, if you're not talking about reparations for Black and Indigenous people, and if you're not talking about dismantling the US imperialist system, you don't really have my attention, because from the get, you don't understand that this wealth needs to be given back to the people who actually created it, whose labor and resources were extracted to create that wealth. And I'm not hearing that from any of the candidates. And unfortunately, what the Democrats especially are so good at doing is identifying the more radical sectors of the masses of the people, and identifying them, neutralizing them, and hiring them for their campaign to be like, hey, and basically the Democrats, what they do is like, instead of being like, fuck you, you far left communists, like get out of here. Instead of doing that, they're like, let me hire you. Let's learn your branding and your how do you talk to your people. And it's this weird kind of like tactic of co-opting that I think the liberal Democrats are so good at doing. And touching on that point, I wanted to ask you, what is your view of Latino or Black youth-led organizations that are promoting this go out and vote, go out and support the Democrats message, or eventually will if they haven't yet? And like, why do you think they're so successful at doing that?
Partly because, they already have a leg into the community because they are members of the community, right? So, just from seeing that, people who look like us and share our background, our socioeconomic status, they get kind of disillusioned by being brought on to campaigns or being brought adjacent to campaigns, um, you know, because, these large national organizations um, typically have an NGO side to them, right? There's the organizing face, and then there's also the 501c3 that funds all the movement work. And hate to say it, but the people who contribute to these 501c3s get to set the agenda for what are we going to be struggling for this year, right? What are we not going to be talking about this year within the election cycle? When there are no elections coming up, that's when you see the more radical face and these campaigns that do serve a function in the movement, right? I mean, what comes to mind is BYP 100, who has some excellent campaigns. She's Safe, We Safe campaign, the work that they do around, so many other issues and campaign work. But at the same time, it's kind of troubling when, the leadership is, again, painting Democrats as, a revolutionary option, rather than just, a clearing in the field of, what I'm saying, of capitalist oppression. The 501c3 machine that, runs a lot of these organizations influence some of the deviationist views that come out of it.
No, definitely. And it seems like they've really got it down to a science in terms of separating, their apolitical side from their political side. And to some degree or another, anyone who's POC, who's in favor of revolutionary activism and views, have come across these organizations and have seen how advanced they are in identifying leaders and recruiting them over to do work for the Democrats. And for me, like, going into my next question that I wanted to ask you is, obviously we're not Republicans, we're not conservatives, because we are against capitalism. We have revolutionary communist views that are pro LGBTQ, pro women, pro global South. And so obviously the Republicans are our enemies through and through. Now, for the Democrats, one of the reasons I'm not a Democrat is because the Democrats still maintain capitalism and imperialism and are just one head of the two snakes, right? I like the analogy of capitalism and imperialism being like a two-headed snake. You have the Republican head, which is more overt in its action. Like, they don't give a fuck about us. They don't give a fuck about poor people. They don't give a fuck about disabled people, disabilities, LGBTQ people. And they'll say it right to your face. And I think that's kind of like the role that Trump plays. And that's why his base has such a strengthening, because it's all these racist white people who are entitled, who believe that they're superior to us. Now, for the Democrats, they try to learn from us. They want to learn how we talk, learn how we walk, how we vote. And the reason that I'm not a Democrat is because I feel like their role is kind of like the second head of the snake of capitalism and imperialism that tries to act like the good cop, good cop, bad cop. And they're trying to get information from us and find a way to lure us back into the US political system instead of pushing us away. They're like mutual understanding and respect. And they use all of these euphemisms to bring people in. And so for me, I think Democrats are actually more horrible and evil than the Republicans, because at least the Republicans, whatever, they're like straight up about their fascism. They're America first and they don't give a fuck. But the Democrats try to play it off as if they're anti-war, they're pro-justice, they're progressives. And I think that's more dangerous to our people, because then our people who generally want good jobs, they want a good paying job with benefits. They want to live in a nice, clean home with running water, to be able, just basic shit, to not be pulled over by the police and to be racially profiled, to be locked up. They just want to lead good lives, hardworking lives. And the Democrats, time and time again, will sell us on that, but then they won't deliver. And so that's why I'm not voting Democrat for 2020 election. I just wanted to get a sense of from you why you're not either.
Yeah, it's just, a more of the same, they're all in some form of another pro-intervention. All of them have supported anti BDS legislation, which is the boycott, divest, sanction movement against Israel. Against Israel. And, if we know anything about the past, the way South African apartheid was broken was partly through a movement similar to BDS. And I think Democrats ultimately just want a larger piece of the imperialist pie to be divided amongst, the already privileged in our society. You know what I'm saying? So a larger chunk of the pie for white men, that's not okay. That's, the imperialism and, the the exploitation that we export, comes home to roost, and we see that in, the belly of the beast with the the American prison system. So, yeah, that's ultimately why I won't be voting Democrat.
Yeah, it's so true. And even like Bill Clinton, like his government, I was recently reading about his administration when he was in Arkansas. I think he was governor or something like that. And a lot of the planes that were bringing in cocaine from Nicaragua through the Contras, right, through the right wing imperialist Contras, were landing in the state where Bill Clinton was in power. And those drugs were being used to destroy the Panthers, to destroy the Young Lords. And the Democrats have been equally involved in imperialist crimes as the Republicans. Let's not forget that under Obama, there were more invasions of Africa than any other US president in history. He expanded AFRICOM on the African continent to its biggest size. He had drone killings all over Pakistan and Yemen and Afghanistan. And he also supported the 2009 coup against Honduras, where my family's from, and entirely wrecked the whole country. He also supported the 2011 coup against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who wanted to create a united African Union, African currency, and resist against US dollar and influence. And the Democrats have done just as much horrible stuff as the Republicans have during their time in office. And I think a lot of times people forget that. They're still used to this false dichotomy. And either way we lose, right? Either way, if we go Democrat or Republican, we lose. And I like to use the metaphor, heads I win, tails you lose, in the sense that either way you're gonna be fucked, right? And it, no matter what, it's just this false dichotomy. And a lot of times, I'm sure you've gotten this as well, that people will just be like, "Oh, well, what are you doing? Like, you're just hating, why? Like, what are you telling people to do?" And what do you think is the best response to that? Because us as communists, we understand that the bourgeois electoral system, as you mentioned, serves the wealthy white ruling class. How do we explain that to people, and how do we begin to direct them in a way that is constructive and productive, counter to their narrative that we're just lazy bums who are haters?
Well, first to point out that, whether, there's a Democrat or a Republican in office, the federal minimum wage has been the same for the past decade. We talk about the cycles of the economy. The way capitalism is set up is there's always a boom and a bust. No matter who's in office, it's always going to repeat itself. So that's the first thing I would want people to open their eyes to. The second thing is that, yeah, ultimately Democrats support war. I mean, they vote for the budget over and over again with absolutely no resistance. I mean, these budgets pass with like one naysayer, and every Democrat votes for it, every Republican votes for it. As we know, war only services, the rich, wealthy investors who are out to plunder the developing world. As far as what we can do besides voting, I think we have to talk about building structures independent of the capitalist system. You know what I'm saying? I think mutual aid is going to be, a primary way that we can resist against, the 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 coming capitalist crisis. I think mutual aid is going to be extremely important. If we look at the Black Panther Party program, part of, the essence of it was to provide for people who are otherwise dependent on, the government. And I think when people talk about, it's a popular talking point when we talk about the U.S. military, is that, oh, people are poor and they're dependent on, the government. They look at the student loans and they look at the healthcare and things like that. But if we had institutions where people could build these things, build actual real people's power, we could ease the reliance on, poor people being funneled into the military. That's the kind of work I would direct people into.
So I definitely want to talk a little bit more about RIOT, the Revolutionary International Organization de Trabajadores, which you co-founded. And again, to everyone who's watching and listening, my name's Ramiro. I'm one of the co-editors of Anti-Conquista. Anti-Conquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. We produce content by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. And we're speaking with Takiyah Thompson, co-founder of RIOT, Revolutionary International Organization de Trabajadores, about the 2020 elections, why they're bullshit, why we as communists believe that we should be doing other work aside from it, not fall for the distraction, not fall for the Democratic Party lies about, this time for real, this is the real progressive radical candidate. How we can avoid that, especially as people of color who have time and time again been tokenized for the liberal wing of the empire, how to avoid that. So we're talking about that with Takiyah Thompson. Before we get into your work with RIOT, I wanted to ask you, are you familiar with a woman named Candace Owens, who is part of Turning Point USA? And she's a conservative black woman who supports Trump and is calling on the black community, the African community, to leave the Democratic Party, but move over to the Republican Party and vote conservative. How do you address groups like that, and also Latinos for Trump as well, that are at almost every rally? How do you address people these people who are colonized and who share their interests and views of their colonial masters and identify themselves as Republicans and conservatives. What message do you have for people like that?
It's a complete misunderstanding. I think the ideology is a complete misunderstanding of, you know, their role in society, or the role that society has assigned for us. You know, I think people who sign on to, Trump support and Republican support, you know, first of all, have completely slurped every lesson from the bourgeoisie, and they completely want to emulate them, become them. Yeah, they want what wealthy white men have, even though the system is not set up that way. It'll never work that way. We're not all gonna get our 40 acres and a mule, right? Not everybody's gonna get a pony, but you know, people have signed on to it because they want it for themselves. So I mean, I think it's the ultimate, selfish, self-serving, but also, self-depreciating thing you could possibly do. So yeah, I've heard of Candace Owens, but never really looked into her, or tried to entertain her, or anything like that. Yeah.
And I know you were telling me about someone, I forget their name, and we don't have to mention if you don't want to their name, but about a tweet you mentioned about someone who supported, basically was saying on Twitter something like, it sounds like y'all don't have a sibling or a relative that's in the military. How do you respond to something like that? People who are using, the military as some sort of justification for supporting U.S. imperialism.
I understand, growing up that we all, I can say that at least me, coming from, a poor working class neighborhood, Brooklyn, New York, a lot of people did look at the military as a way out of their circumstances. If we are going to call ourselves revolutionaries, or if we are going to call ourselves justice-loving people, we have to understand that the role of the military is essentially the role of the police here in, the United States. Twin hands of domination, So there's no justification for joining the U.S. military. Yeah, and I think the peoples of the developing world, of the third world, ultimately, have a say in the justice that they want to see from, even so-called revolutionary ex-members of the military. It's not my place to judge these people as someone who lives in the first world and, does benefit from the trickle down. But yeah, I think ultimately there's no excuse for joining the military, especially if you have an understanding of the role that police serve in your own country.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And unfortunately, so many people in police departments, like I live out here, I'm from New York as well, but I live out here in LA now, and a lot of the LAPD are Black and Latino cops who are doing the dirty work for the white imperialists themselves. And it's a tactic that is not new as well, because under the Roman Empire, for example, the Romans, whenever they colonized a new area, they would hire locals to patrol and repress their own people. And in exchange, those people were called the auxiliary class. So there were three main classes. There were the patricians, the plebeians, and the auxiliaries. And the patricians were kind of like the ruling class. The plebeians were like the lower class, the colonized people. And the auxiliaries were the upper crust of the plebeian class, who were hired to repress their own people, but were given a false sense of entitlement and share of the pie of the Roman Empire. And that same model is being replicated today in the United States, when you see that a majority of ICE, for example, are Latino agents who are repressing their own people. You have cities where you have black mayors and black police chiefs that are locking up black youth at really high rates. And it's a model that time and time again has never been overthrown by working within the system or trying to act like change is going to come from within, but change has always come from the overthrow of those empires and the establishment of a new societal class, as we've seen in places like Cuba and Angola and other places. And so I wanted to ask you on a more personal level, what has your experience been like with these NGOs that promote liberal democratic policies? And how do you feel that people can learn from your experience?
My experience with liberal NGOs has basically been that the ultimate goal of the work is to take back to the donors. You know, the ultimate goal of the work is to present a nice looking portfolio, some pictures of some rooms full of black and brown kids being distracted and when you try to call out the contradictions within the NGO, for example, the fact that we're supposed to be fighting for a better world, but within the NGO, you have a board that's overseen by you know these these people with beefed up salaries who are like sitting directly at the table with the donors, whispering sweet nothings into their ear all the time. So I mean, you end up with a hierarchical structure that exactly replicates the capitalist structure that the NGO says it's trying to overthrow. So that has been my experience. And my experience, what I would say to people, wanting to get involved in, the nonprofit sector, it's a job just like any other job. It's not some noble service to the people. There are, of course, it's of course a clearing of the path. It's better than working at I don't know, an oil refinery or something like that. You know what I'm saying? But the contradiction is that it does tend to replicate the exact structure that it's claiming to do away with. And this is not to discredit the clearing in the field of of the little bit of good that nonprofits can do. Like, I mean, for example, the ACLU does stand up a lot of times for people who are genuinely being repressed by the government. Believes in free speech for Nazis as well as for legitimate. So the thing is, there's going to be contradictions, and you just have to understand that working at a nonprofit is, it's better than nothing, but at the same time, there are contradictions that ultimately have yet to be worked out with nonprofit work. So
Right. And I find that a lot of times in these NGOs that support liberal and democratic policies, they have tokens who are elevated to like higher statuses who they use as examples of like, you should be more like this person who knows how to follow instructions and spit out the Democratic Party talking points. And the second you're a radical black or brown revolutionary who's calling things out, you're immediately isolated, you're immediately targeted, you're immediately branded as being divisive, being counterproductive. And the whole point of these NGOs is to kind of pacify and neutralize any real alternative resistance to capitalism and imperialism. And I think that function has, like, I think the US, if I'm not mistaken, has the most NGOs per capita in the world. And there's like more NGOs than there are like hospitals and schools. And the whole point is to channel in that revolutionary energy back into electoral politics, kind of like an exhaust pipe, right? Because otherwise, if there isn't an exhaust pipe, then it would blow up. But the NGOs allow room for criticism and activism, but within a certain realm, right? Within a certain lines, it's like, what do we want? Justice and democracy, but not socialism and reparations. That's like a whole different thing for them. And so for me, I think from my experience as well with those kind of organizations is that you have a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned young radicals who go into those spaces with the idea of actually changing things. And unfortunately, so many of those people become jaded and are like, fuck everyone, every organization is corrupt. And then that feeds back in to the cycle because then that pessimism also, which is, justly understood, right? Because they're being like forced out, then that pessimism contributes to things like anarchist understanding or an understanding that like, like a nihilistic understanding that all organizations, all structures are bad. And I wanted to tie that in with the work that you're doing with Riot, because I know you started Riot not too long ago down there in North Carolina. And, just tell us a little bit about what the organization stands for, why you created it, and what you're hoping to do with it as an alternative to things like voting in the election.
Okay, so the express purpose of Riot is to educate and organize oppressed people. And we believe that most importantly, we have to struggle for unity and dignity and liberation ultimately. Right now, uh, we have been going to court for my mom, who was, we had our house raided, and, after my mom played Malcolm X speeches in her backyard. So we're going directly up against the state in that struggle. But we also believe in educating one another. Some of our events, we've talked about Black women in the movement, held letter writings, you know, and we believe that above all else, it's important to build community. And part of that is just knowing one another, so knowing the members of your community, knowing who's going to be looking out for you. You know what I'm saying? So a lot of community building events, getting to know one another, getting to know what each other's struggles are, basically. And we have an event coming up for Black History Month. It's going to be the history of Black radicalism in the United States.
That's cool. And on that point, I wanted to also ask you, like, what makes Riot different from other revolutionary organizations in terms of the ideology? Because I think one of the things that I find cool about Riot is the centrality of the most oppressed people bottom up, the representation of Black women, of LGBTQ folks, people who are traditionally excluded even within leftist circles, in terms of images and in terms of like dialogue and representation. What kind of philosophical approach do y'all have to like capitalism, and also in terms of uplifting oppressed nationalities and oppressed identities?
Society is aligned along many different factors of class, including gender, race, our relationship to the means of production, and we believe that all forms of class society ultimately, whether that be 100, 200 years down the line, ultimately, for the sake of um, humanity, have to be overthrown, right? And our approach to Black and brown and LGBTQ and oppressed communities is that these communities are directly held under the boot of capitalism, that they face the most exploitation and are given the least opportunities in our society. And makes those sectors of our society the most revolutionary, and that above all else, that we have to connect with members of those groups and funnel them into a movement for liberation.
That's beautiful, beautifully said. And I think the work that y'all doing is really cool. And I think just for people to get a sense of the event, can you just go ahead and also repeat the name of the event that's coming up, the date, and how people can find out more information about it?
Okay, yeah. So it's the history of Black radicalism in the United States. It's going to be February 22nd, the Saturday, You can find out more. You can follow us on Twitter, which is riot_revolt. We're more active on Instagram. It's the same, which is riot_revolt. We also have a website, riotrevolt.org.
For sure, for sure. And just to wrap up, thanks again for joining us. It's really been cool to talk to you about 2020, and for me, it's been like a breath of fresh air talking to you, because a lot of times there's so many liberals out there and people who are like, a few weeks ago were like, decolonize, and like a few weeks ago the same people who were talking about indigenous resistance, and which is cool, like I support that, for like Indigenous Peoples Day and stuff like that. The same people I'm seeing now who are like, let's vote for Bernie, let's vote for Warren. And I'm like, especially Warren, who tried to play off like as if she was an indigenous person herself, which is fucking disgusting. And I was just like grossed out. I saw somewhere on Twitter someone called her like the original Rachel Dolezal, and I started cracking up. Oh, just before we wrap up, what do you think about that whole situation with Warren?
A lot of people of color trying to defend it, and it's indefensible. Blood quantum is not the same as indigeneity. Yeah, I feel like we have to let go of the race science that says, if this ancestor way, way down the line that you have no connection to, no cultural ties to, no claims to, that you can just claim you're a member of that group, Yeah, the Warren thing is just, it's crazy. I mean, it's one thing to tell your friends, hey, I think I might be a little Native American. And it's another thing completely to pass yourself off as an indigenous person. It's absolutely not okay.
Yeah, I thought that was disgusting and weird. And to me, she's just like the most robotic candidate ever. Like there was some video that they put out of her, like some campaign video, and it's like, have a beer with Elizabeth Warren, and it was like the most awkward fucking video I've ever seen. And she's like, "You want a beer? Yeah, you want a beer? Cool, let's have a beer and talk." And it was just so weird, like, and I was just like, these are the people that we're supposed to fucking like vote for and we're supposed to support. And I don't know, at least Obama, like Obama, I have so many critiques of his policy, but at least he was a little more smooth than fucking than Elizabeth Warren. You know what I mean?
At least we were tricked for a little while.
Right, exactly, exactly. But anyway, Takiyah, thank you so much for joining us. Please, we have to have you back on. We're gonna share your content. There's gonna be that event coming up in February. We'll post some more details about it on social media. Make sure to go out and support. Make sure to go and follow riot_revolt on Twitter, and also follow Takiyah on Twitter. I forget what your handle is. What's your handle now?
Unruly baby hair, but I'm on private right now.
Okay, all right, cool, cool, cool. She has some funny ass tweets. I follow one of your favorite tweets that you put out that had me dying. I was telling Ophelia about this the other day when you were like, NGOs are always talking about having retreats. What are y'all retreating from? And I'm like, yo, that's so true. I'm like, they're acting like they're in the jungles with like AK-47s and shit, like fighting Nazis, and it's just like, but again, it goes back to that whole point of, these liberals, poverty pimps, trying to brand themselves as revolutionaries and trying to sway our people into voting for the Democrats. So I'm so glad you called them out, and I'm so glad we were able to talk about the 2020 elections, why they're bullshit, and how us as communists can organize independently of any bourgeois electoral system, especially in the United States. So thanks again for those of you who are watching and listening. Again, my name is Ramiro. I'm one of the 5 co-editors of Anti-Conquista. Anti-Conquista is an anti-imperialist media collective. Our content is produced by and for the Latin American and Caribbean diaspora. Shout out to Takiyah. Peace out, Takiyah. Have a great weekend, and let's talk again soon.
All right, cool. Thank you.
All right, peace out.